That's a Commission statement on the subject of the American Jobs Act. Mr. Commissioner, you have the floor, and you are going to kick off the debate.
Mrs. President, honourable members, I share fully the honourable members' fight against protectionism generally. The Commission is putting particular emphasis on open markets and the role of trade for growth and jobs. This is why we are such a staunch defender of multilateral trade rules and why we continue to fight against protectionism in fora such as the WTO and the G20. Throughout the economic crisis, we have managed rather well to maintain open markets and avoid the easy trap of closing them, which would have had very grave consequences. This is not different when it comes to our relations with the United States. We remain in close contact and address barriers where they arise bilaterally or through the WTO system. The Transatlantic Economic Council plays a crucial role in preventing trade-distorting measures through focus on non-tariff barriers. And I must say that this new approach, agreed between Deputy National Security Advisor Mike Froman and Commissioner Karl de Gucht last year, is working well. The whole idea of the Transatlantic Economic Council is to prevent divergent regulations before they arise through upstream regulatory cooperation. In other words, working together in areas where we are just beginning to regulate in order to avoid the barriers of tomorrow. This is at the heart of moving closer to a transatlantic marketplace where further integration will work for the creation of jobs and growth. Estimates put the number of jobs depending on transatlantic trade at 15 million, and our shared aim is to strengthen this. The recent announcement of the American Jobs Act the honourable member was referring to would, according to available information, subject the proposed new spending on infrastructure to Buy American requirements. While this initiative is still at the stage of legislative proposal, we are closely looking into its details and potential impact on EU suppliers. We are raising our preliminary observations with our US counterparts, both bilaterally and in the framework of the WTO Government Procurement Agreement. Our immediate aim is ensuring that the rights of our suppliers are not limited. We are generally concerned about such measures being envisaged or adopted by any trading partner. We believe that open trade should be promoted as an essential requirement for fast recovery. I thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Commissioner. Now we come on to speakers representing their political groups, and we begin with the group of the European People's Party. Mr. CASPARY, for 2 minutes, please.
Madam President, colleagues, our Commissioner has suggested now that the Commission is trying to keep in contact with the Americans to avoid any new trade barriers from appearing. But when I read what the Americans are planning right now, what's in their proposal, then you actually see that none of the funds appropriate or otherwise made appropriated may be used.
Alteration, maintenance or repair of a public building or public work unless all of the iron, steel and manufactured goods used in this project are produced in the United States.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, I think that's absolutely unacceptable. I think we need to say that clearly to the Americans. That's got nothing to do with partnership, it's got nothing to do with friendship. That's pure protectionism. And I think that that hurts the Americans' interests themselves. And I'm sure they're fully aware of it. So I hope that the Commission is not going to leave this up to the European Parliament to get the point across. I hope that the Commission takes this into their own hands. So I think it's a shame that we have just simply a defensive strategy. Why don't we try to take a bit more of a leap forward? We've seen the kind of interests that lie behind policy in the United States. We've also seen the problems of the crisis in the European Union. Why don't we go to the Americans to make a proposal? Why don't we say that we have a common transatlantic project which would lead to a kind of common pact for economic growth and employment, so that we could stimulate the economy on both sides of the Atlantic? It's my conviction that instead of simply being defensive and trying to convince the Americans that they shouldn't follow these kinds of plans, I think we should be more offensive. Why don't we try to create a joint package with the Americans which would stimulate the economies in the largest world economies? So why can't the European Commission become active on that front? Thank you very much.
Mr. Caspary. Mr. Caspary.
Mr. Caspary, please. Mr. Rubik asked for a question. Do you agree? Yes. Mr. Rubik, you have the floor.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. I would like to ask a question of Mr. Caspary. What is your opinion of the WTO round, which is reaching its final stages? Because in December, and I think that this will be particularly important given the backdrop of the economic crisis, for this round to come to a successful conclusion, to open up new opportunities for economic growth. Do you think that here America and President Obama would support the WTO round actually becoming a success?
Do you want to answer?
Sure. Yeah, lieber Paul Rübig und
Yes, Mr. Rübig, colleagues, I think that's precisely the problem, that in the WTO framework we've seen no progress for years. And I think that the Americans have made a major contribution to that lack of progress. This proposed legislation does not suggest that the Americans are serious about market opening. So I think that that makes it even more important for the Commission to look for new ways forward. I think the proposal I just made, the idea of creating a transatlantic partnership for growth and employment, I think that's something which would stimulate both economies on both sides of the Atlantic. So I think that that would be a good suggestion. So I think that would be a very good way to stop the Americans going down this path.
Okay, we'll continue our debate now.
Mrs. Schaake for... no, I beg your pardon. Mr. Susta, I misread it. Mr. Susta, on behalf of the S&D Group. Thank you, Madam President. We could summarise this debate by saying that while Athens is weeping, Sparta is not crying, because the US is also going through a crisis and is trying to come up with the measures to emerge from it. But the whole world is full of wrong signals as to how to relaunch our economies. We are looking a lot at regulating the financial markets, but looking less about how to make the world economy grow. And we need to go past the discussion between those who want rigour and those who want to stimulate growth. We need, of course, rigour as far as public resources, expenditure is concerned, but we also need to grow. That's why we should be very worried at any sign of protectionism. They're coming from the US, they're coming from Argentina, they're coming in from Brazil with the introduction of new taxes. They're coming from all parts of the world now because of the economic problems that Mercosur is facing. We need to look very carefully at this, and we need to understand that world markets, if they're going to grow, need to eliminate barriers. Mr. Caspary's put forward a very interesting proposal, a very valuable proposal. I think as we open world markets, we should have a huge new Marshall Plan for the developing countries who are competing with us. We didn't like the Buy American clause, but I think that's been voted down in the US Congress anyway. these measures need to be placed in a new context as we try to approach the world trade and economy holistically. We need, of course, to look at Europe's interests, but we need to have the whole world economic architecture dealt with through a new Bretton Woods. Thanks very much, Mr. Susta, says the President. Now it's Mrs. Schaake on behalf of the Alliance of Liberals and Democrats.
Thank you, President, Commissioner. America and the EU face similarly large challenges when it comes to solving the economic crisis, and cooperation should be our intention to sustain this recovery. There is, however, a serious discrepancy between EU and US measures that is reason for concern. The US protectionist tendencies in its Job Act seem to block access to public procurement for EU-based companies. This is not only the concern of this Parliament, but also of large amounts of the US business community itself, who worry that the Job Act is out of step with a balanced US procurement policy and will undermine the US ability to grow exports and jobs through accessing foreign markets. Countermeasures may well be the result, such as we saw in 2009 from the Canadian side. Trade is needed for job creation, and trade is global. In global trade, the US should not alienate one of its closest partners, the EU. We both face the challenge of emerging economies and additionally have a number of opportunities, such as the development of a comprehensive transatlantic growth and jobs initiative, which would include plans for the removal of remaining non-tariff barriers to trade and investment by 2020 and to take steps towards the zero tariff levels of some product areas. Now that the Senate has voted against the Jobs Act in the US, this should be the moment for the EU to address some of our problems again. Can the Commissioner explain whether he sees a difference in the impact between Buy American and Buy America, respectively applying to public procurement on the federal and the local levels? These remarkably similar titles could easily confuse people. Is Buy America applicable to Canada and EU partners despite the WTO General Procurement Agreement, such as Canada and the US business community argue? Or is Ambassador Kirk right in rejecting these concerns? Will the Commission push for reciprocity in the public procurement rules between the EU and the US on both federal and local levels? The asymmetry between the US and the EU's access to markets is striking. I would like to learn from the Commission what have been the results of conversations with the Americans on this subject so far, and whether it proposes flexible rules or measures to put in place from the EU side should that be necessary. And I would also like to ask what this Parliament and the Transatlantic Economic Council could do to help the Commission sustain openness and global trade between two sides of the Atlantic. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Mrs. Schaake. Mr. Sturdy from the ECR Group.
Thank you, Chairman. A lot of what I was going to say has been said. I totally agree with what Daniel said. We're at a crucial stage in the world economic crisis. The US has G20 commitments to which it must adhere. We should be working together to bring both our economics together in difficult circumstances. Furthermore, the US should be further integrating its economy into those Western worlds, especially those with whom it shares values. This is because of the rise in Asia. Daniel touched on some of the problems there. Let me just remind the Commissioner, who said that de Gucht had made an agreement a year ago. For public procurement in the US, there is a 25% tariff on anything that goes in from outside the United States. Now, if that is shared values, then there's something wrong. And I'm going to ask the Commission if they can answer two questions. Does the Commission consider closer economic integration towards a transatlantic marketplace a realistic goal? What action does the Commission take to develop, together with the United States, an involving comprehensive transatlantic growth and jobs initiative, which would include plans to remove the remaining non-tariff barriers to trade and investment in 2020, the so-called transatlantic market, and to take steps towards zero tariffs levels in some product areas? Chairman, while I've been in this Parliament, and I've been here quite a while involved in the Trade Committee, there's been an ongoing battle with the United States over Boeing and Airbus. The WTO court ruled recently in Airbus's favour. What has happened? What has the Commission done to ensure the survival of the European industry? It is vital for jobs at a time when the economy is suffering. And I call upon the Commission to look further. The Commissioner's leaving now, so he can't answer the questions. I'll leave it, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Sturdy. Mrs. Figueiredo, now on behalf of the GUE Group.
Thank you very much, Madam President. Well, I think reality is really showing how unsuccessful we have been in pursuing austerity policies. We've been following the best possible liberal policies, following policies of privatization and stability and growth pacts, etc., etc. But I think that we've seen this with this crisis that we can't simply continue in the same manner. We're supposed to be trying to work to reduce poverty and social exclusion and reducing social injustice. So that's why I think it's important that we need a pact for jobs and social progress rather than a pact for stability and growth. Because we need to ensure that we really help workers. We can't simply be imposing new taxes. You see what's going to happen in Portugal, Greece, Ireland, etc. I think it's time to break with these policies of monopolistic capitalism, which are basically worsening the economic situation, deepening social inequalities in our countries. So this is at the same time as we're preparing to give billions of euros to the banking sector. Basically transferring the banking debt into the public sector for young people and women who find themselves in situations of unemployment or precarious employment where they can't live a good life or earn a decent livelihood. I think that it's a shame. I think that we're seeing a massive loss of purchasing power among our populations. So I think that I need to express once again our concern of what's going on in the United States. But we need to propose to the responsible parties in the European Union, the Commission and the Council, that they need to turn around the terrible situation of unemployment and precarious employment, social inequality, social exclusion. This is the situation that prevails in many European countries. So this will simply get worse if they persist with the same policies. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Figueiredo. Mr. Bloom, now on behalf... I beg your pardon? Sorry, Mr. Bloom. Mr. Caspary. Who do you have a question for, Mr. Caspary? Mrs. Figueiredo?
Geschätzte Frau Präsidentin, ich hätte eine...
I would like to ask a question to the previous speaker. My question is as follows. Does the previous speaker share my estimation that the European Parliament has not been taken full account of by the Commission? Because the Commission, in fact, in the middle of the debate, has changed places with another commissioner, and we can't get an answer to the questions that we've asked. I mean, do you agree with me that this is not the right way to treat this Parliament?
Thank you, Mr. Caspary. Do you want to answer the question?
Yes, Madam President. Dear colleague, of course I'm absolutely in agreement with you on that criticism for the European Commission. I think it's not correct behaviour. I don't think the Commissioner has acted in the right manner. I think it's a shame that he makes his speech and then just disappears and doesn't actually listen to our criticisms with regard to this issue. So I do hope that the President of the session passes on our unhappiness with that situation.
Jolly good. Thank you very much. That wasn't really on the content of what Mrs. Figueiredo said. It was really more of a point of order addressed to the Commission. Anyway, Mr. Bloom, I apologise. You have the floor, sir.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. It's a shame, really, that the Commissioner's gone, because he would learn so much from me. Unlike most of the people here, I actually have commercial experience. I've actually run companies. I actually know what I'm talking about. I'm going to talk about jobs. I'm going to talk about jobs now. We have 40% in parts of the European Union, 40% unemployment, youth unemployment. And it's suggested by people here that that's some sort of act of God. It isn't an act of God. It's sheer unadulterated incompetence. Look what you do. Look at the barriers that you put in front of companies, particularly small and medium-sized companies, in employing people. You have minimum wages. You have pensions, you have holiday entitlements, you have a job tax called national insurance in my country, which is absolutely huge. So the employee doesn't actually get half the money that's being paid by the employer. Trying to get rid of lazy and incompetent workers is virtually impossible. So sacking people is very difficult. And if you can't hire, you can't fire. So you lose flexibility. We've got maternity leave, paternity leave, stress leave, and all the rest of the nonsense that is invented by people here with absolutely no commercial experience at all. It isn't an accident we have 40% of our young people unemployed. It's your fault. And let me remind you of liberty of contract. In a free society, we should have liberty of contract so an employer and an employee can get together, sign a contract and get on with their lives without interference from this place.
Thank you, Mr. Bloom. Mr. Sturdy wants to take the floor. Will you accept the question, Mr. Bloom?
I'd like to ask Godfrey. I don't live very far from where he lives. And I thought he understood that I ran a business. In fact, I ran a number of businesses and ran them before I came into this Parliament. You obviously didn't hear what I was talking about. We are actually talking about America, not about the United Kingdom. We're talking about the impositions. My industries and my businesses are directly affected by decisions taken in the Jobs Act of America. And I'd like to ask Godfrey why he assumes that every speaker has never had a business background. Thank you.
Mr. Sturdy is an eminent businessman, very close to where I live, and he is one of the few exceptions, and I apologise to him.
Okay.
Okay, on we go with the list of speakers as Mrs. Flašíková Beňová.
Thank you very much indeed, Madam President. Vice President of the Commission, we're talking about the American Jobs Act, and a lot of ground has already been covered in the course of the debate. It was not adopted by the American Senate, so here we're actually looking at this from the vantage point of compliance with international trade rules. We have to act in the interests of the European Union. On the one hand, you can say that strong actors will adopt protectionistic measures when the going gets tough, and very often trade agreements are pushed to one side in hard times. On the other hand, I think that the level of ambition demonstrated by the Americans when it comes to trying to tackle the crisis is something I find sympathetic. Now here we should perhaps be looking at whether free trade rules are being impinged on by this, but here, really, what about the European leaders and what they've been doing? Have they shown a comparable level of ambition? We're hearing arguments being put forward saying that the crisis can't be dealt with on the basis of deficits, but we have to look at coming up with an inspirational response to the crisis. I think that we can take inspiration from this, and our national leaders should allow themselves to be inspired as well.
Thank you. Mr. Schmidt, for 2 minutes, please.
Madam Chair, to Mr. Bloom, I would say I'm happy every day that we have such a wise colleague and such a humble colleague. Jag delar, fru ordförande.
Madam President, the criticisms that have been levelled at Obama's attempt to increase employment, but also reduce the freedom of markets. We do know that opening markets is a way to progress and better economic situations across the entire world. So I think it's quite surprising. I think it is quite a mistake in the idea of increasing the freedom of markets. Now, it's suggesting that the Republicans are actually better with regard to free trade. I think a lot of our colleagues can think back to our European experiences. Yesterday we had a new proposal on agriculture policy, which is anything but free trade. There are quite a number of proposals in this House where we seem to be imposing restrictions on trade in Europe. But I think that at this very moment when Congress still doesn't really know which way the decision is going to go, I think that we are in a position to negotiate a better proposal, a proposal which responds to the economic problems in the USA, but also the economic problems that exist in Europe. Madam President, the serious deficits are the main problem here, but we need to ensure that the USA manages to overcome their deficit too. We have the same problems in both Europe and America. That's the absolute basis for allowing the economy to function properly. I'll close by saying that the Tea Party movement in the USA is making it more and more difficult for Obama to put forward a decent proposal. We can't forget that fact. That if we let's just hope that we can do without a Tea Party movement in Europe, because it's going to make it more and more difficult to carry out a good, healthy economic policy. Madam President, I must say that President Obama is a good friend and a good fighter when it comes to supporting Europe. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Schmidt. Now, Mr. Scholz, for 1 minute, please.
Madam President, Mr. Šefčovič, we're talking about a topic which is linked to economic cooperation. We're talking a lot about the financial crisis, the bailing out banks and the euro, incredible sums that are being made available, which would have been enough right across the world to promote employment and in so doing overcome hunger. Now we're talking about people whose day-to-day existence is being affected by this crisis. The banks which we're bailing out have, because of their speculations, forced millions into unemployment, and they have irresponsibly put pension funds at risk. The American Jobs Act is something which President Obama wants to do to once again put the fate of these people back in centre stage in political life. Now, he wants to unburden companies if they employ new workers, and that's the right way to go. Now here, this non-policy of throttling the economy through austerity madness is something which has to be put to a stop. And here, if we're talking about promoting domestic products, that's something which I actually emphatically support. I think that you should make use of the forthcoming Transatlantic Economic Council in December in order to, in this context, take a concerted approach and to prevent a downward spiral ensuing. And I think if we're talking about a new start for employment, that's something that's worth talking about. The European Parliament, in the framework of the Transatlantic Legislative Dialogue, will be playing a very active role. Now here, we've been talking about the Occupy Wall Street movement, which has been given support by millions of Europeans and can act as inspiration for others.
Thanks very much. Mrs. Göncz, for 2 minutes, please.
Thank you, Madam President. Of course, we're looking at American protectionist initiatives, and we have to be very cautious in taking action on that. But there's another aspect of this whole issue that I'd like to look at when we're talking about the American Jobs Act package. What I want to look at is this radical different direction which is being taken compared to the direction being followed by European leaders. And I think we need to take account of that when we're thinking in terms of European plans, because the Congress didn't let it through. But I think it's important for us to look at a number of the proposals contained in that package. For example, investments in infrastructure which create jobs. And looking at reducing taxes on labour, we need to look at investments in education, which is something which we have emphasised, because we've said that without proper education we won't see any economic revival. We need to protect jobs in the public sector, and we need to do something about increasing the length of time for which people are entitled to receive unemployment benefit. Now, here in America, these plans have been launched in order to try to adopt several instruments which will help tackle the problem of unemployment. Now, here, if we're saying that we have to have a solution, we have to create jobs, we have to support education, because there's no other way out of the economic crisis. This is something which European leaders also have to learn. We've seen weak, belated measures, and in fact we haven't relieved the impact of the crisis, but in certain instances we've worsened or exacerbated it. Now here the real question is whether we will see genuine European investments being increased. Will we see the contours of that emerging in the near future? Thank you.
Thanks very much. Mr. Le HYARIC, please. Thank you, Madam President. The big difference between the Obama presidency and the EU institutions is basically his determination to try to restart growth through consumption and create jobs and to use taxation and monetary policy creatively. That's why the Conservatives in the USA are against all of his plans without exception. And your transatlantic plan simply isn't going to work. It's going to be free trade and competition which will decide a winner. What we need to do is come up with a new system of cooperation which won't need protectionism. We need to change the role of the European Central Bank and the European banking system. We need to change the European Financial Stability Fund for a European Social Development Fund, a green fund which will help develop public services, education and jobs, and help SMEs as well. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Le HYARIC. That brings us on to the Catch the Eye procedure. I've got 5 colleagues down on my list, and we begin with Mr. Kelly.
Mr. Kelly.
Obviously, protectionism is not acceptable, and particularly if it impacts on EU companies and suppliers, we've got to fight it. For that reason, it's only right we should be discussing the American Jobs Act today. As a member of the EU-US delegation, I'm looking forward to discussing this in more detail with our colleagues in upcoming meetings. But I agree completely with my colleague, Mr. CASPARY, who says that the Commission has to be far stronger, far more proactive, and indeed I would say far more aggressive in dealing with this situation. I read recently that the majority of Americans now think that their future lies with closer links in trade and in other relationships with Asia than with Europe, and that might just tell us what they think of Europe and where we are going. And certainly the message that Mr. Caspary is giving here today, the Commission have to take it up, otherwise we might find ourselves more and more marginalised in the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Kelly. Now, Mrs. Băsescu.
Thank you very much, Madam President. Financial investments for creating jobs is an essential idea for economic growth. I think it would encourage the employment market in the United States. I think it's a very good idea that there are tax breaks for small and medium-sized companies too. The American Jobs Act also talks about tax breaks for companies which employ new workers. It's also reducing payroll taxes. This is including more than $100 billion of investment in public works. So all of these provisions could be good for America, but they would limit the possibilities for European companies to work in the United States. We need to ensure that there aren't any protectionist measures imposed here. These would be unfair measures for the world economy. So I think we need to ensure that there is good international cooperation here.
Mrs. Prendergast.
Mrs. Prendergast.
US President Obama's proposal for an American Jobs Act contains many elements and policy initiatives which sorely lack a European equivalent. However, Conservative forces in the US Senate blocked their approval for 2 days in a stance paralleled in Europe by the six-pack austerity-only approach to the severe economic crisis we find ourselves in. The Buy American provision enshrined in the American Jobs Act, which emulates Obama's approach in the 2009 American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, is understandable in the face of US unemployment figures, but protectionism is not the way out of the economic woes afflicting both sides of the Atlantic. Through work in the Internal Market Committee and the EP delegation to the US, I have emphasised the untapped benefits of further transatlantic market integration. There is much work to be done to improve network interoperability and to facilitate SMEs' access to the transatlantic markets. Upstream regulatory support and cooperation between the US and the EU is still incipient and could prevent unintended trade barriers. We are far more likely to spur growth and job creation if we work together rather than retrenching a sad repetition of post-Great Depression protectionism. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Mr. Brons, please.
Whilst I have doubts about the effectiveness of the American Jobs Bill, if enacted, it's heartening that the President understands the problem, if not the solution. President Obama, in his press conference announcing the bill, summed up the problem succinctly. In Maine, there is a bridge that's in bad shape, with bits falling off it. Meanwhile, we've got millions of laid-off construction workers who could be busy rebuilding roads, bridges and schools. We nationalists have a saying, whatever's physically possible must be financially possible. If it's not, the financial system is at fault. Any reflationary injection must be spent into circulation and must not be credit created by the banks and lent into circulation. The problem with all such reflationary measures is that injections of money precede, sometimes by years, the resulting increase in GDP and are therefore inflationary. This effect might be reduced by partly deferred payments to recipients of reflationary spending. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Brons. Mrs. Jażłowiecka.
Dziękuję, Pani Przewodnicząca.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Ladies and gentlemen, the past 20 years were a period of extreme good prosperity in America and in the EU. Balanced economic growth, however, was not so balanced when it comes to individual social groups. We did not fight poverty enough. That's why we have now the crisis and the brunt of the crisis hits the poorest parts of the society. The debts are very heavy, just like they were in the 30s. One of the key issues for today is to find an answer to the question how to put a boost to our economy. We have to realize that economic development is realized not by millionaires, but by ordinary people. And this is what we see in the American Jobs Act proposed by Mr. Obama. Jobs are found not in places where you produce very expensive yachts, but on the contrary, in companies which produce goods and services for ordinary people. So the way to economic growth is not by limiting your budgets, but mainly by making the consumption rise. So let's not worry about millionaires. They will do very well without us. Let's worry about those who, as a result of the crisis, have their lives broken.
Thanks very much indeed. Any other colleague wants to catch my eye? No, apparently not. Okay. On behalf of the Commissioner, Mr. Šefčovič represented the Commission since the previous one went.
Thank you very much, Madam President. First, I would like to apologize for changing the guards in the middle of your debate, and it in no way means that there is disrespect of the Commission for your remarks for the European Parliament. This change was necessary because Commissioner De Gucht is working on exactly what we've been discussing today, free trade in Korea, and my colleague Šemeta had to go on an urgent trip to Moldova. But I would like to assure you that all your remarks, all your questions have been properly noted, and if you will not feel the satisfaction by the answers I will provide, we'll be very happy to continue our discussion in written form. If it comes to the topic we've been discussing today, here I really would like to thank you very much for putting this very important issue on our European agenda. Because I think that you are very right, that if it comes to the protectionism, to the trade barriers, Commission has to behave very responsibly and very actively. And this is exactly what we always try to do. And I think that you very rightly pointed out the specificity and the importance of the trade relationship between the United States and European Union. If you look at the size of the relationship, at the size of the economy, and as it was rightly pointed out by one of our honourable members, that there is a feeling that the future of American trade lies with Asia. I always say, let's have a look at the real figures. Let's have a look how big the GDPs of all BRIC countries are. And you know that all of them together have smaller GDP than the United States. And you know that the United States has smaller GDP than the European Union. Therefore, our trade relationship is the most robust one. It creates 15 million jobs on both sides of the Atlantic. Our trade represents more than 400 billion in trade goods and more than 260 billion euros in services. And if you look at mutual investment in the mutual stock options, so there we are talking about more than 2 trillion euros. So it's very solid, very robust trade relationship, and therefore it requires appropriate care. And therefore we are investing so much energy in tech contacts and in tech cooperation between the Commission and the United States, represented by White House in this particular case. Because we know how much we can gain if we are able to remove just one of the barriers, and how much we could lose if the new barriers are erected. And this would be exactly the approach the Commission and Commissioner De Gucht will take on the next upcoming very important negotiations, be it part of the EU-US summit at the end of October or the subsequent tech meeting which will take place a day later. So to conclude, Madam President, I would like to assure you that we remain in close contact with our American partners, and this issue, which was raised by several members of the European Parliament, will be followed very closely, and that the Commission will do all necessary to defend the rights of the EU businesses and EU job holders, and protecting the good economic and business environment between the United States and the European Union. Thank you very much, Madam President.
Thank you very much, Commissioner. Colleagues, that is the end of the debate, and we're going to now take a break until 11:30 when the votes will take place. Thank you very much indeed.